Welcome to the first panel presentation of the International Writing Program's Fall Residency. This year, 2017, marks our 50th anniversary, and in addition to our weekly panels here at the Iowa City Public Library, weekly readings at Prairie Lights and Shambaugh House, a weekly film series in Adler Journalism Building, and a host of special events and collaborations with our university partners in the dance, music, Spanish, and theater departments, I wish to draw your attention to a week of events in mid-October to celebrate 50 years of continuous service to world literature, culminating in the gala dinner that Alice just mentioned on October 11th. For those at home watching on TV, more information about the visiting writers, samples of their writings, the hundreds of free public events we will host in the coming weeks, and that special week of celebration, please visit our website, iwp.uiowa.edu. A word of thanks to our sponsors, first and foremost, the Iowa City Public Library, which makes this space available to us every Friday at noon. International Programs, which brings us the pizza and drinks in the back of the room. The Graduate College of the University of Iowa, which is our home unit. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the State Department, and the various ministries of culture, private foundations, and individuals like you who contribute to the success of the International Writing Program. In translation, as metaphor and as reality in our ever more hybrid world, translation is now ubiquitous. Languages live side by side, commingle, influence one another. New words, accents, grammars, forms of data are surging everywhere, sometimes like the floodwaters along the Gulf Coast, more often in subtler ways that nevertheless shape our daily interactions and literature in general. A writer may switch between languages within a piece of work, or may self-translate, or may, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, deliberately refuse to avail him or herself of a major language for the benefit of a minor one. Do you too live, create, think on a linguistic fault line? This is the question we have posed to our distinguished panel of writers, who are, in order of presentation, Ubah Cristina FARAH, who's a fiction writer, poet, playwright, translator from Italy. She is a Somali-Italian novelist, we might say, performer, teacher, and social activist. Her two novels, Little Mother and The Commander of the River, tell stories of the Somali Civil War and its refugees in Italy. In 2006, she was awarded the Lingua Madre National Literary Prize, and in 2008, the Vittorini Prize. She has a PhD in African Studies from the University of Naples and currently lives in Brussels. Audrey Chin is a fiction writer and nonfiction writer from Singapore. She has a PhD in public policy and worked in investment banking. I think she's actually our first hedge fund manager at the IWP, which in this age of global finance seems altogether appropriate. Her story collection, 9 Cuts, was shortlisted for the 2016 Singapore Literature Prize. The same year, her novel At the Heartbones Break was a finalist for the Singapore Book Awards. She is the organizer for the Singapore Ladies Asian Literary Book Group, promoting Asian literature in the community. Kristian Sendon Cordero is a poet, fiction writer, essayist, translator, and filmmaker from the Philippines. He writes in Filipino, Bicol, and Rinconada, and has translated Borges, Kafka, Wilde, and Rilke into those languages. 2 of his most recent poetry collections received the 2014 National Book Awards. His debut collection of poetry in his 3 respective languages won the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award in 2006, and he is the deputy director of the Ateneo de Naga University Press. Next to him is Antoinette TIDJANI ALOU, a fiction writer, poet, translator, scholar, and our first participant from Niger. She teaches literature and directs the program of performing arts at Abdou Moumani University in Niamey. She has been the president of the International Society for Oral Literatures of Africa and a collaborator on the Women Writing Africa project. Her first work, On m'appelle Nina, retraces the exilic experiences of a woman who leaves Jamaica for France, then Niger. A short story collection, a volume of poetry, and a memoir are forthcoming. And finally, Kinga Toth, who is a poet, translator, illustrator, songwriter, performer, Hungary. By now you're getting the idea that these writers can do a lot of things. And I pray to God they can also give us some great recipes. Kinga has published 6 books of poetry, all self-illustrated. Her visual poetry has been exhibited widely. She is the lead singer of the experimental band TÓTH Kinga Toth and is working on the visual sound poetry projects X and Moonlight Faces, for which she received the 2017 Haza Attila Award. Please join me in welcoming these terrific writers.
Born in Italy, and my parents were students when they first met. My mother was from Verona, in Italy's north, and my father from ALOU, a small village on Somalia's northern coast. He had received a scholarship from the Italian government to conclude his studies at the university in Verona. When he graduated, my father decided to go back to his country, and my mother and I were to follow him 1 year later. The first time I saw Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, the city where I grew up, I was 3. It was the summer of 1976. To be honest, I cannot remember anything about my mother's feeling on that occasion, but she must have been very excited because it was also her first time in Mogadishu. I cannot remember anything about my father, who must have been excited as well, since he had not seen us for over 1 year. Finally, I cannot remember anything about my impression of the language, which must have seemed so different to me. In the years following, my mother told me many times about that day. In the Italian we shared, she talked about the language, maybe because she hoped her memories were similar to mine. Indeed, neither of us understood Somali then. My father, on the contrary, never spoke to me about that time, maybe because he knew that his memories couldn't be similar. Somalia was the country where my father was born and raised, whereas to my mother and me, the surroundings appeared new and luminescent. Since my mother never learned Somali, I would later act as her loyal translator. Reflecting on my life between these 2 languages now, my ear for language developed in a domestic setting with its daily life and small intimacies. I say that I do not remember anything about my arrival, but there is something that happened afterwards, which was like a tiny ripple in my memory, something about the moment in which my first language mixed with the new language. They mixed so well that were it not for this vague memory, I would think that the 2 languages have been born together inside me, like a single bush springing from 2 roots. Iskadal, born together. This is what they call people like me in Somalia. In this memory, there is a small hedge, a hibiscus hedge, that I'm hiding behind it, alone in the house of my uncle Ali and my aunt Khadija. Alone, without my mother, I mean, and without my father, the only ones who could understand me. In the house, there were not only my uncle and aunt, but also their 6 children and my grandmother, Barni Hassan, and many others. My cousins were laughing, but I didn't feel like laughing. I didn't want to laugh. So I ran behind the hedge. They say, "Come here," and almost shouting in my mother's, not my father's language, I answered, "Non capisco niente. I understand nothing." They were all laughing except me. My grandmother, there that evening, sent for me to console me with a new name solely for me, Ubah, a word that means flower in Somali, like the hibiscus of the hedge. So it's not coincidence, this is the only thing I can remember, like a ripple in my mind, the only memory I possess in which the 2 languages are separated. I can understand one, I cannot understand the other. I cry out using one, I'm silent in the other. a single memory in which there is a small hedge, a hibiscus hedge I hide behind. Since that day, those two languages have lived together inside me. In Somali, home is guri, from the verb gur, to move. Many years later, in January 1991, at the outbreak of the civil war, I had to flee the country. On arrival in Italy, I sought out songs, texts, any form of material from Somalia that made it possible to keep my country alive. I enjoy making use of Somali songs, fables, and tales in my work. Writing for me is a way to put together two words that were separated. It's my attempt to harmonize two coexisting cultural landscapes. Yes.
I'm going to talk about living and creating along a linguistic fault line. I often wonder if I should be called a creative writer or simply a translator. I live in Singapore, and if you take a look at this, you'll see the sort of cultural diversity of my country. And I write about Southeast Asia, which is a multilingual, multicultural archipelago. So I'm constantly grappling with how to represent characters speaking in different languages or different Englishes while maintaining a single narrative voice and rendering oral languages into written formats while also retaining the right cultural context. And I only write in English. So an example of my creative writing process at work can be seen in my novel, As the Heart Bones Break. It spans 60 years in the life of a Vietnamese man whose character's voice I first heard in my head in Vietnamese, which I speak quite fluently, and then I translated it into 120,000 English words. So the novel is about a man who's uncertain about the identity of his father and his own ideological leanings during the Vietnam War. And he tries to resolve these issues concerning filial piety, allegiance, lineage. A major theme is the impossibility of outright victory for either warring party because of kinship ties cross-cutting the political and ideological divides. I wrote this book for two reasons. Why does a Singaporean write a book about the Vietnam War? Yeah. So first, because I married a man whose blood father was a Viet Minh commander, but whose adopted father, who was the commander's best friend, worked for the French. And my husband's upbringing occurred in a French housing compound that was never attacked by the Viet Minh for obvious kinship reasons. Second, in 2003, the US invaded Iraq. And many of my Vietnamese acquaintances felt it would be a replay of Vietnam, another US quagmire in a field of relationships it didn't understand. I leave history to judge whether this is true, but at the time, I felt it would be timely to retell the Vietnam War story from a Vietnamese perspective. So I'm actually just going to talk about translation because like in translation, I wanted to capture an echo of Vietnamese in my English writing, a language that generally uses kinship terms when referring to people. Hence, navigating kinship terms in English and Vietnamese was critical in creating a realistic voice. To foreground, actually I don't know what foreground means, okay, someone edited this. To emphasize the protagonist's integration into his adopted family of South Vietnamese loyalists when he actually in the end chose communism, he's always addressed as youngest, which signals a hierarchy. In turn, his siblings are nameless and always referred to according to their birth order, oldest, fifth, sixth, sister-in-law, etc. On the other hand, to emphasize the otherness of the protagonist's American-born Vietnamese wife, my characters and the story actually always refers to her as Nina, never by the Vietnamese beloved or wife or sister-in-law. But relationships develop. So for instance, when the protagonist's tutor reveals he's a communist, he suddenly addresses the protagonist as Gon, which means son. And this binds him to the obligations of being a loyal son, so he won't tell. The fluidity of these referential pronouns pose difficulties when choosing an appropriate point of view for the story. I first wrote it in third person. Unfortunately, such pronouns always signal age, status, and the other person being addressed. I actually had some handouts, but they weren't printed, so I don't know if John maybe can flash them up later, on the screen or something. But for example, he, as a child, might be no, which is just like that kid over there, or am, which is little brother, or gon, which is child or son. And in manhood, he would then be hun, which means him in a very formal way. Or he could still remain gon, which is child, if his parent is talking to him. This sense of the protagonist's maturation could not be created in the English third person. As for the first person, except in highly formal situations, Vietnamese rarely use the word for I, which is tôi. And so in service to the story, I chose a second person point of view and decided to narrate the story from the perspective of an ivory wedding bangle, which channels the spirit of the protagonist's deceased mother, because she's actually the only character who truly knows who his father is. And this is not, as Chris and I always say, it's not magical realism or fantasy. It would be actually a very natural way in our culture to think that your mom will come back in her bracelet to tell you your story. Critical reception of the second-person point of view has been mixed. Vietnamese-born reviewers overwhelmingly favored the second person. They thought it was aesthetically appropriate. It was not too... Actually, they hated the first-person version because they thought it was too self-centered. But American reviewers and one Australian-born Vietnamese, and I think it has something to do with individualism, they found the use of the second person jarring. It was very off-putting, they said. They bristled at having to become the protagonist, and this was actually an intention I never had. And it's interesting that other English language speakers, Australians, British, Canadians, were not upset. So in conclusion, I have to have a conclusion, right? I'm similar to a translator in three ways. I translate from another language, a language I hear in my head. I seek creative solutions in English. And finally, I'm read by readers who may not understand the nuances of the cultural perspective I'm writing from. It's here, apparently, where one finds magic, danger, and possibility in writing across a language divide. So for some, the second-person point of view created an unintended imposition of another's experience. I guess what I hope is that my novel will help my readers set their assumptions aside and discover empathy.
Yeah, magandang araw. In the Philippines, a country roughly of 104 million inhabitants, approximately 149 languages are spoken. To be a Filipino, therefore, is to live and breathe in a multilingual atmosphere, which includes English, the language we inherited from American colonial education. However, despite aggressive efforts since the beginning of the 20th century on the part of our colonizers to educate native populations in English, the average Filipino continues to associate English and Spanish with the colonial elites, creating a linguistic hierarchy roughly corresponding to a social hierarchy. In my school days, those who dared to speak the local languages were either extorted, we were made to pay 25 cents for every local word we uttered. We were punished or both. Filipino, or what many still call Tagalog, was promoted as an alternate state-sponsored national language. Still, many consider the vernacular languages, among which Filipino is included, to be inferior, ineffectual, and impudent. Within the last 5 years, however, it seems there has been a shift in the thinking about the importance of the local languages. Many young writers from the countryside now write in their local languages. Others who began their careers writing in English or Filipino, like the poet Luis Cabalquinto, now either translate their old works in Bicol or are writing new works in Bicol from the start. In the context of our ever-shifting government policy, Congress recently passed the mother tongue-based multilingual education, which mandates that classes be taught in the local language. Regrettably, however, despite the program's good intentions, such top-down policies only reinforce existing hierarchies and privileges in public education rather than achieving any real change in the mindset of the people. Having facilitated many of these workshops, I have often been approached by teachers and parents to discuss the difficulties they face when teaching in their mother tongues. This is largely because of a lack of good pedagogical materials, but also because of their unfamiliarity with the languages. These are the parents and teachers who were punished during our times. So, as a matter of convenience, they either resort to English or Filipino. In my opinion, inequality between languages can be mitigated by interrogating our existing multilingual reality against the backdrop of this pernicious legacy of colonialism. To this end, we must integrate translation as a key component in our pedagogical praxis and develop an approach to language and literature that views them not as close, petrified specimens of culture and ethnic groups, but rather as works in transit. In other words, literature and language should transcend their origins and expand the range of local languages and literatures, like in my mother tongues, Bicol and Rinconada. Therefore, when I translated Borges, Kafka, Rilke, and Chapek, I was well aware and conscious that I was waging a counter-movement against prevailing policies and mindsets that privilege English over our local languages. I am happy to note that at least the Tigaunon-speaking population of Buenos Aires, not in Argentina, but in this small island called Ticao, whose access to Spanish and English might be limited, can now access Borges, this book, in Bicol or in Filipino. Metaphorically, I prefer to think of translation as a kind of awakening. When translating Kafka into Bicol, this book, I deliberately changed the title, The Metamorphosis, to Ang Pagkagimata ni Gregor Samsa, or The Awakening of Gregor Samsa. For me, the word pagkagimata has a spiritual or revolutionary undertone similar to the word awakening. I translated Gregor Samsa's dialogue into Rinconada precisely when his speech was most incomprehensible to his family. This language, Rinconada, the word Rinconada comes from the Spanish word rincon, which means at the corner. In contrast to Bicol, the local media, the university, and the Catholic Church prefer not to use Rinconada. The latter remains an oral language. But with this translation, both Bicol and Rinconada can experience a kind of metamorphosis, in part because this is the first time since our colonial history that both languages are being used together in the same text. I view this work not as a self-contained literary or linguistic artifact, but rather as work in transit, which despite limitations has started opening new doorways for my two mother tongues. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before entering into my presentation, I'd like to preface it by saying that translation is about bridging gaps and unsilencing the other. Today is a sacred season for millions of the world's people who either yesterday, today, or tomorrow will celebrate the Eid el-Kibir, the sacrifice of the rams. I am from a Muslim country, Niger, and I know that tomorrow people at home will be celebrating what we call the Tabaski feast in my absence. In respect of this, I would like to wish Eid Mubarak to all people of Muslim faith and Muslim culture, especially those of you who are with us in the room today. My paper is entitled The Trans Writer as Passeur. Traditori is one of those elegant phrases we learned as language majors without the background of the political and aesthetic battles to which the expression alluded. Renaissance Europe and the fight for cultural supremacy and aesthetic absolutes were worlds away. Translator, traitor, was a pedagogical taunt, meaning that we as students would never get it right, that we would never approach the original work with optimum beauty and accuracy. There was nothing like the original, the masterpiece, the primordial word of a creator. But for me, there was nothing earth-shaking there. That was simply a question of academic work. In fact, I have always enjoyed I've always had a perverse enjoyment of the challenge that translation offers. I flow when possibility becomes a neat and meaningful page. I am a translator at heart. I became a translator indeed in the realm of academic life as a high school student, a university graduate, a university postgraduate. Before my Bachelor of Arts was in my pocket, I had changed linguistic life worlds, and translation became my daily life. And sometimes the butter on my bread, if not my bread and butter. I had myself been translated. I had switched worlds. Jamaica for France, Jamaican dialect and English for French. No, it was not a switch, but an accretion. After French, Hausa in Niger, and later some Zerma in the same country, new possibilities opened, short circuits occurred, bridges were crossed. In Versailles in 1985, I conversed with a Mozambican student, he in Portuguese and I in Spanish, and he took a picture of me perched on Marie Antoinette's armchair, which was forbidden. We did not know this. And so we flirted with the forbidden, the unintended, the necessary crossing of word bridges to reside in the in-between. I was destined for all of this, starting with my name, Antoinette, not necessarily a very English name in English-speaking Jamaica, and of course with my island origin, where diglossia is the order of the day for most educated people. We always switch from Jamaican dialect to English and back. Later, glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, was added. My tongue grew flexible, brave. It became a mixer. To fast forward to the exhilarating present, I can say that I have translated thousands of pages, a great deal of academic work by others, a bit of my own, a bit of literature, oral and written. Most of my translation has been social science works. And in the most recent past, I've had to translate my own writing from English to French and back, since I write in both languages. To focus on the translation of literature alone, one might ask, what have these experiences taught me about the process of translation? I would like to say in just 4 pointers that, for one, translation is not simply about words. Secondly, translation is creation in another language. Thirdly, translation is horrendous. Self-translation is horrendous and impossible. And lastly, the translator is a transwriter and passeur. I shall conflate these points below. Translation is not simply about words. Every translator, practice or potential, will tell you this. As soon as you have a mastery of 2 languages, many people will think that you can translate from one to the other as a matter of course. This is not the case. Translation is not natural, it is learned. So, it is not enough to have the words lining up, ready for use, like sprightly dancers poised for a quadrille. You have the words, then you do battle with the words, with the meaning, with the worlds, with yourself. Sometimes with another person over all of this. And so, my mentor and friend Fatimata Munkaila and I fought for hours about the translation of a Zamu from Hausa, from Zerma into French. It was a reasonably short poem. There was a French translation which we both thought could be improved. I was to translate the poem into English, but the French translation seemed problematic. The words were all French, but the translation made little sense in places. It was the music, she said. We couldn't sacrifice the music. I understood the point, but pointed out how pointless it was to have music and no meaning. And so we fought, and I translated it my way. This and other experiences have impressed upon me the idea that translation is creation in the direction of another language. The idea that the translator is a transwriter and a passeur. The idea that the translator is a transwriter or a passeur are terms that I have not yet encountered in my reading. Transwriter is not just wordplay. It is a resume of living and writing between worlds. In the Francophone world in which I have lived for 32 years now, passeur refers to the go-between paid by a desireful and adventurous alien to take him or her over into a bright new world. The passeur is not necessarily a mercenary, but is certainly a doer of the impossible, whose work deserves not only symbolic, but also financial reward. Thank you.
That's the most important thing.
My paper is about translation, mutation, and in-between zone. So I hope we can do an operation together if you're up to it. Magyarországon az én generációm magyarul beszél, és néha Deutsch and English. Writing in my third and weakest language, as you can hear already, is English. It's therefore like using the DNA of Hungarian to create a human body in English while drawing life support from German vocabulary. So it's a mess. When I translate into English, I often think in German first, or while performing the physical examination, I pierce words with a Hungarian scalpel. Take, for example, my translation of Roland Barthes, The Pleasure of the Text, from Deutsch into English. The text has the form, question mark, forma, shape, figure, I don't know, of the human body. It is a character, figure, I don't know. And an anagram of the body. So that the pleasure of the text is found in all those moments where my body follows its ideas, like I'm doing now. This spring, I presented a paper in a workshop in Hildesheim, Deutschland, focusing on the monstros in the language. Monstros, the monster, the beast, the fenevad, a szörny, a szörnyeteg, a borzasztó szörnyeteg, a szörnyeteg, a szörnyeteg. Szóval a szörnyeteg. Instead of concentrating on stigmatizing what we might call monstrous text because of their hybridity, we must instead recognize their supernatural qualities, bringing language like Frankenstein's monster back to life through the assembly of organic and foreign limbs, or supernatural in the sense that language is always evolving and is not yet within reach. Actually, in this particular moment, we are creating the monsters together. Because now I'm translating, somehow, and you are recepting it. So you probably are my adressates, and we create the monster, the Frankenstein, together in this land of these three languages. And also some sounds, you will see it. So this is a new text body. If language is a body, we must handle it with care, because translation is like a blood check, ensuring the body is functioning, the checking of vital signs, substantives, and blood cell count, just as nouns, adjectives, and verbs are constituent element of the text. More important than these molecular, what is it? However, is an understanding of body chemistry, the application of science to ensure the text body functions as a whole. At this moment, if I'm really honest to you, for example, I'm wondering, should I write a Dada poem instead of this paper? It would be so lovely. That's a great idea, isn't it? Or communicate in music and sound. So like, if I'm doing this, everybody knows it's a monster, isn't it, huh? Then we don't need to write this out. Yeah, let's go back. So I often turn to it if I'm in a very not nice mood, you know, or if I'm just checking for the right words and my English and my Hungarian and my German doesn't help me, then this is the sound I always find, or like the music of it. So recently, I transitioned from focusing my microscope on my translation to performing the Frankenstein work on my own text. That's the best thing, actually. After translating my first two books into German and English, I began experimenting with hybridity. I recently published a book in translation, and this is in German actually, but I will show you that it's not that German in the end. So there are 60 poems there, 20 poems translated from Hungarian to German, 20 left mutating from Hungarian into German, I know, and 20 that I Bosch coded. What I'm talking about now. Bosch is a German company, so if you live in Europe, it's very likely that your washing machine or your hairdryer or your mower is from Bosch company. But they are working not with just kind of machines, they are also creating prosthetic limbs and the last things, so there are other things which are top secret and I already, you know, signed the paper, so I cannot talk about it more. At Bosch Stuttgart research field, I worked as an alien artist placed in the creative zone to observe the future of drones and AI, that's all I can say. There they use codes instead of words, so for example, if we talk about it, let's have a chair, or let's sit on a chair, they might say it, yeah, let's have a VXW, or a VX20, or a VX20A. That was actually the chair. My book, therefore, is like a keyboard, comprised of 3 different evolutions. So first is the traditional translation into German, that's okay. The second one is translation with 1 text leg in Hungarian and 1 text hand in German, so the mess is coming now. And the third is, it's a German, but full of Bosch code parasites, which someday might like a symbiotic organic language to reach the universal. So it's a great idea, but actually, in fact, it's a great mess. In Hungary, there are great linguistics, and let me tell you one story which is very important, I think, and we should talk about that. There is one linguistic professor whose name is Nádasdy Ádám. Actually, he is Shakespeare's voice in Hungary. He wrote an open letter recently, actually a couple of years ago, and the title was The Illness Metaphor, a betegség metafora. It's a piercing, very important, hilarious critique on Bárci Géza, another guy. He's also a linguistic professor, who worried that foreign languages, and now the part is coming, would infect the purity of Hungarian. He referred to this corrupting process as a decomposition, or more clearly, the infection alarm of the non-appropriate mode, and so on. He referred to foreign words as pathogens that language desperately had to dislocate, eject, or kill. In Nádasdy, so the guy before, He points toward how dangerous this moment of this kind of puritanical thinking can be, especially when viewed in the context of the Second World War, when these languages were inhabiting human bodies. So I think it's kind of dangerous. Why do I mention that? Because I cannot emphasize enough the importance of translation in our warning times. Today, more than ever, we must mutate. Let's find the music of it. Let's find the resonance, but also the Frankensteinian beauty on the operating table of the in-between room ourselves. And instead of this paper, I took something which is hopefully more fun, and I got the permission, so let's enjoy together.
You guys want to watch more? Should we start?
It's so cool. There are all the languages there. Please, please.
All right.
So I try to talk about this the whole time. It's way better, no? Isn't it?
Lovely.
Ubah.
Yay!
Should have started. If we didn't want to start, then everybody would have been happy.
Yeah, now we were together. That's why I wanted that.
Wonderful, thank you. We've shown lots of strange things over the years, and that's right up there. Two quick things before we open it up to questions. For those at home who want to see the presentations, they end up on our website, iwp.uiowa.edu. And secondly, do we have mics to go around today, or? We do have mics, so wait till we get the mic for you so that the people listening at home can hear us. So we'll begin with questions. I think we see John in the back. We're seeing if we have liftoff. We may not have liftoff. Yep, now we do.
Okay, we have liftoff.
Good afternoon, Kristian, and thank you for your explanation of the complex language situation in the Philippines.
Hi.
I've never heard such a brief and concise explanation.
Thank you to my editor.
Well, then second, given that books are very expensive in the Philippines relative to the family income, how do you get paid for your work?
As a translator. Yeah. Well,
For your artistic work?
You teach and you encourage students to buy your works.
In other words, it's a class requirement.
Sort of. But let me maybe talk about how the books, for instance, the Borges translation was funded by the Programa Sur of the Republic of Argentina. Despite my limitation to Spanish, they funded it because I was working with other Filipinos who speak the Spanish language. And for this, I think we were given $3,200 for the whole project. For the Kafka project, I coordinated with the Czech Embassy. The ambassador of the Czech Embassy in the Philippines is very much into these things. So what we are doing in the country right now, we tap the Czech ambassador and he's talking to other European ambassadors to encourage them to publish, to translate European works into Philippine languages. So I told him, I personally influenced him that you should not just focus on Filipino and the national language. We should develop the other regional languages. And, you know, that's how we do it now in the country, connect with the embassies.
Does anybody else want to take on that question of how translations get funded in your countries?
Well,
It's really a great question about cultural diplomacy.
Antoinette
right?
talks about getting paid.
yeah, thank you. It kind of depends what kind of translation you're doing. So if you have a commission translation for, let's say, translating the anthropology of development like I did, or I don't know, the Black diaspora of the Americas, then actually the person who asks you to do the work will have to pay or get funds to pay for that. So that's a different kind of thing. But if you're doing cultural translation, if you're doing self-translation, even if it's another book, then oftentimes nobody pays you. You don't get paid. Or then you have to think of creative ways of doing this. For example, there's a translation project I really want to do. I think it's one of the very best novels in Niger, and it's very central to my research on the figure of a freedom fighter from that country. And I'm writing a book about it in English, but nobody can actually get the book in English because it's not translated. I want to translate the book. And the publisher, who would love me to do it, wants me to wait until somebody will fund the translation, because then it's no fun for him to translate the book and not get any money out of it, because translations do not necessarily sell immediately. So it is an issue about, you know, it's very nice to talk about, you know, bridging gaps and crossing lines and abolishing frontiers and so on, but there is a practical issue, you know, of who will pay the bill.
It's quite good to be a translator in Singapore now, because we have all this is quite a prosperous government, and they have all these schemes, they have these ideas. So one year they're going to promote computer languages, and another year they're going to promote us as an international financial center. So I think the fashion for the last 2 years is we're going to become an international translation center. And actually, so all the translation non-profits have actually been getting quite a lot of grant money. And I know 2 years ago that we had a whole initiative to go to Yangon to translate the works of Alfian Sa'd, who's a Singaporean gay Muslim poet. And he went to Yangon and worked with all these Burmese writers to translate his works, and there's a huge initiative to translate Southeast Asian works into English and into the other languages. So, I mean, there are these issues like political correctness, blah, 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 blah. So maybe the canon could be quite boring. And it's a bit random, because it depends on whether a civil servant is going to wake up and go, oh, we shouldn't have done that. But you can try, you know, because I think they're giving away quite a lot of money, especially if you're a Southeast Asian writer.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like translation and transliteration, I know they aren't the same thing, it's based on sign and signifiers. Like that cartoon, I don't speak German, don't read German, but I knew what that cartoon was from the sign and the signifier. And it all boils down, if you can't speak English, you can't land the plane. So that's the translation, that everything ends up in English. Because English is the center, and everybody else has to try to aim for these ignorant people, especially in the United States. We only speak one language, but that's our fault.
What we need to point, what I think is really important, that we mostly talk about the text form of the text and or the written text or the text form of the language. We must not forget that text has different characters too. It has a visual character, it has an appearance, it has a performative character, it has a sound character. And I think if we think about translation, we really should check all the characteristics of this text. So I do believe in that. If we cannot, for example, land in the language of the English, then we can still grab the sound and the visual element and or body as a performative object, let's say that, or a machine, to be translated or to be connected. So when I'm translating something, I always go back to the core, back to all the sound and visual elements and the characteristics of the text. And if I'm not able, because of my level of different languages, to make it correctly, then I can create a sound installation, I can create a visual installation, and this is also translation. So I think we should also think about that. The whole thing is about how we reach each other, how we are able to communicate or give the information. It's very easy, just giving the information and find the right tool. And what I also want to point, and then I finish, translation in Hungary is, in this moment, more like a politic act. We do it voluntarily because our current government is focusing on building some borders, building some fences, building some walls. This is really his aim and the followers, so his followers' aim. We want to be open. We want to kill these borders. And this is the thing we can do to reach your colleagues, to reach other type of literatures from other countries. And we can also publish it. Sometimes it's not funded. It's not that important in the moment. The importance is to share the ideas. And I'm in a leadership of a Hungarian literature organization, and we do it a lot. We also have magazines where we publish different languages and translations of languages. And I also mentioned that, and I want to mention it here also, that if you have this idea, this crazy idea to have our work in Hungarian language, then please contact me, because I have a lot of colleagues and they are really interested in that, and we want to open this very small country in Middle Europe. Yeah.
Okay, Kinga, so we take you up on that, right? Yeah. Just two short comments. One about English like being some kind of a central language in a so-called globalized world. First of all, I think English is losing a lot of space to Spanish in the United States, so that people of the United States who do not speak Spanish will probably find themselves as foreigners in their own country. You're pretty much becoming a bilingual country very fast, and a lot of translation is happening. You know, when you go online to buy anything, they do ask you to press 1 for Spanish or 2 for English. So the world is changing under our very noses, even right here in the United States. But on the ground in our countries, there is quite a lot of translation that goes on that hasn't got to do with reaching an outside audience, because the globalization process also happens in reverse, because the world comes in the form of international policies, in the form of international non-profits, in the form of all sorts of dictates to the government from outside. And these things have to be translated into the local languages, because most of the populations, at least in a country like ours, Niger, French is official language, but we also have 10 national languages. Most people speak 1 of 2. But then when policy is being circulated, when ideas need to be circulated to the population, they have to be translated into these languages on radio, on television, through community radios, and so on. So a lot of translation happens outside of this, English and the other languages kind of thing. And the other thing, too, is that translation is extremely political. So if you take a country like Niger, for example, where it's the French, the backyard, and the chasse gardée of the French is their space, colonization is pretty much still going on. When the Germans come in, so the French will be, funding things in the French language and French language programs. But when other cultural diplomacies come in and they want to have their own cultural space, what they do is promote translation into the local languages rather than French. So a lot of other things do happen as well.
And I just wanted to say that if you go and travel in Southeast Asia, there are very few guides now who speak English. They all speak Chinese.
Yeah.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yeah, Usha?
Yeah. We just welcome.
So talking about translation, Ubah, this question is for you. So memories are usually formed through experience. So when you shared with us about the hibiscus hedge, it's about your experience with the hedge, Are you as writers actually struggling because you're wanting the experience to be written, but your memory is actually because of the experience? It's not because of the language or the writing.
I wanted to show how somehow language and memory are connected so strongly. And for me, of course, I grew up in Somalia, and very soon I went to an Italian school. So my formal education has been in Italian, and Italian was also the colonial language. Many people of my father's generation used to talk Somali and Italian between themselves, between them, and somehow Italian was the language of the people that were educated. So it had this kind of connotation. And then I think that after the independence, they tried to introduce the Somali language in the school. So because Somalia is a country where everyone speaks one language, it's quite rare because in many African countries they speak different languages, and so they wanted to unify the population. And Somalia was colonized by the British, by the French, and by the Italians, and they wanted to have a language that could, in which they could communicate using the bureaucracy. And so what happened was that. Somehow, you see, at home, my mother would speak Italian, and also this kind of translating her thoughts to other people as a child was something that it was very challenging for me, because translating doesn't mean only translating as we said word by word, but it's also translating emotions or rage or happiness, and so it's somehow your body can sense it, and you understand all these feelings in you. You feel all these feelings in your body, and what I tried also to do in the writing was that. Because my formal education was in Italian, but I had all these memories of songs or tales that were taught to me when I was when I was in Mogadishu. I tried to insert these poems and to rewrite them in a way that was comprehensible to Somali. And another thing that I wanted to say about translation is that, as Kinga said, a text is not only a written text, but for me, for example, voices are very important. So somehow, when I write, I try also to reproduce in another language, which is Italian, stories or things that were told me in Somali. It's not only a matter of language; it's also the way you combine this word, the way that this, and the way you speak also. So somehow I try to put together all these memories and these two words. Thank you.
I think we're actually out of time, but John, do we have is it a quick question that Javier has? Okay, make it quick. Yeah.
Well, so Ubah, you said about how your mother speaks one tongue and your father speaks the other. So and we all have this word, the mother tongue. So if language is like this umbilical cord that takes you back to your origin and your identity, translation could also be a way of cutting that umbilical cord. Like when you cut the umbilical cord and get free, do you think it's a way of freeing yourself from that identity and origin? Anyone can take it, or anyone?
It's very complicated, Javier. I think as I have experienced it, I think there's an accretion. You accumulate these different languages, these different musics, these different sensibilities, all these rhythms and phrases, and they become you. I don't think that it's okay, I don't think that moving from one language to the other, you become a different person or you have to cut an umbilical cord. I think it's just layer upon layer and intermixing, and all this alchemy becomes you in the world, you in the word. That is how I experience it.
For me, it's like letting the parasite inside of my body. That's it.
Yes.
Just let.
I think also that somehow, as you said, perhaps language also connected with identity. When I speak in Italian, I have a personality and an identity. When I speak Somali, I have another one. But it's all the same. It's always me. So it's Yeah.
I think that's right, because I always eat in Cantonese.
That's a good word for it.
I eat in Cantonese because it's my favorite food. And I suppose I fight with my husband in Vietnamese. And with hedge funds, you just talk in this funny mathematical language of the money's going up because the macroeconomics is going down because blah, blah, blah. And I think each of this is a different part of you.
Yeah, I have two mothers, You can have, invite more mothers to your like that kind of thing, Javier.
Well, I think that the IWP is a great accumulation of languages, music, sensibilities, and also cuisines. and before we leave, I want to mention that we have a reading at 5 o'clock this afternoon at Shambha House. You can hear writers from Kazakhstan and Macedonia. Tomorrow night at Prairie Lights, speaking of translation, all of our Spanish language writers will be reading. On Sunday, Prairie Lights. Sunday night, Cinematheque. And key thing, Tuesday we'll be celebrating Walling Angle, the co-founder of the International Writing Program, in a special event at the Biology Building East at 7 o'clock. Please give a big round of applause for these terrific writers.